Alô? Bom dia, bom dia. Bom dia a todos. Tá rolando um eco aí. Bom dia? Agora foi. Bom dia a todos. Vamos começar o dia de hoje, né? O segundo dia, eu acho, de conferência do SBSC. Né? Depois de... Os que estão acordados, depois da recepção de ontem, né? Das caipirinhas e da comida e da capoeira, tá? Com nossa palestra internacional, né? Que é a professora Naja. Bom, vocês já devem ter percebendo que está acontecendo alguma coisa ali no telão, né? Então, eu vou só dar uma introdução antes de apresentar a Naja, né? A gente colocou, de forma meio experimental, uma tradução simultânea da palestra, que não está pegando nada porque está para inglês. If I were speaking English, then maybe it would be translating correctly. Né? Então, descobrimos isso, ela descobriu. Quando estava vindo, né, de véspera, e a gente olhou e falou, vamos experimentar. Tá? Então, ela vai fazer a palestra dela em inglês e vamos ter essas legendas geradas por IA em português. Oremos, né? Tá? Então, eu queria dar as boas-vindas, queria que vocês recebessem também a Naja. Vou falar a biografia dela em... Oi? Aqui. Então, bom dia a todos que estão nos assistindo no Instagram, no YouTube. Bom dia a todos. Estamos aqui no SBC diretamente de Salvador, né? E vamos ter a palestra da professora Naja em alguns minutinhos, tá? Eu vou, então, falar rapidamente a bio dela, né? Vou dar uma apresentação dela em inglês, já para vocês se acostumarem e para o Microsoft PowerPoint não ficar completamente alucinado aqui, tentando traduzir do português. Tá? Só um detalhe, é que como ele pega as vozes, né? Então convém a gente fazer silêncio. Então, não pode ser que ele comece a tentar traduzir qualquer comentário assim da plateia. Tá? So, it is my pleasure to introduce today Professor Naja Hoelten Moeller, who I met at a group, I think the first time, right? A while back. And Professor Naja is an associate professor at the Department of Computer Science, University of Copenhagen. Denmark, and she works on computer-supported cooperative work. Surprise, surprise. Her research unfolds through a deep engagement with issues of responsibility, friction, and the enactment of fairness in technology use and design. Her work draws on participatory methods, and it explores how adaptive, data-driven technologies introduce continual forms of change for practitioners in the workplace, but also for citizens and others who engage with these work processes. In this context, her work raises questions about the challenges and opportunities opened up by the use of large data sets to optimize work in the future workplace, for example, in super hospitals. She's the founder of the Confronting Data Collab, and there's a link, I'm sure she'll show it for you. So Naja, thank you very much for joining us, and we'd love to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Adriana, and good morning, everyone. Bon dia. Let's see if it translates. I can see that I need to speak a little slow, but please just give me like a sign if it goes too fast, and then I'll slow down so that we have the translation all the time. But thank you so much for inviting me, and it's a great pleasure to be here in your lovely country and to meet your lovely community. In this talk, I will point to the way that we as a research community are very well positioned to investigate power differences in technology, based on lessons learned from my own research into public sector technologies. To set the scene, and now I hope that you can see the images here in the back. I know it's a bit blurred. But to set the scene, I will introduce with this piece. It's an art installation, the bunnies you see here in the back, by Danish artist Anna Ørberg from her recent exhibition called Tech High. The installation shows a scene playing from an AA meeting, Anonymous Algorithms. In the AA meeting, these algorithms dressed as bunnies, they share their stories of how they were abusing pattern recognition, artificial intelligence, and even predictive policing as they go through 12 steps to better themselves. I see this piece in relation to the public sector and debates in research on the possibility for data, automation, and AI. For me, researching differential power in data and AI in public sector technologies is importantly a question of who is allowed to participate in debates and have agency, and what are the different accountabilities that we design into our future technologies and society. And so I like to draw on art as well, as a way to invite everyone into a debate, also the people I collaborate with. So my talk today is structured around 3 themes. First, I will talk about what I see as 3 critical problems for CSW. That also is what I've centered my work around for the past couple of years. Secondly, I'll talk about job centers or unemployment services and the consideration of AI in this context as an example of a critical public sector technology. And finally, I will talk about what I call the collab approach of my research group. And this is critical for how we as CSW scholars can engage both with our democratic institutions and the people we collaborate with. As is clear from my background and my path into computer science, it's shaped by political theory as a way to understand also computational technologies in the public sector as something unique, and also basically how technology always comes with politics, privileging some interests over others. Whereas the politics, and let's see, do we have it all here? Whereas the politics of technologies has been a clear focus in CSW, the explicit acknowledgement that technologies are becoming a new form of governance is a rather new research agenda. And this is where I position my work. Existing research in public technologies has so far focused on the analysis of data, automation, and AI after these new forms of technologies have been designed and institutionalized into the decision-making processes that gatekeep our society and public services. Similarly, stakeholder inclusion in research has also often been limited to professionals with knowledge of data and technologies, whereas individual citizens' lived experiences are often left out. This research agenda on public technologies as a new form of governance is sparking important conversations. Here it is Alison Powell's recent book, Undoing Optimization from 2021. Maybe you have heard of it, that inspired my research in several ways in relation to what it means to be a digital citizen in datafied society, where participation and who can claim that democratic rights requires a new type of skill. Another important contribution is Race After Technology. It's a great book by Ruha Benjamin, which forcefully shows how there's not such thing as unbiased data in public services when we make decisions on what to track, what to support. Going back to the bunnies and the art piece by Anna Örberg here. It represents this deep interest into how we can ensure this democratic dialogue and grounding of public technologies when we work with all kinds of stakeholders. We learn researchers such as Alison Powell and Ruha Benjamin and others that democracies have always been fraught with disputes about rights and responsibilities. Another important researcher in this area, Carl de Salvio, argues, along with other CSW researchers, that democracy occurs through our local actions and environments, just as much as national and global equivalents. So democracy is something that we are involved in making, feeling, and doing. We encounter and construct our democracy also as researchers. So for me, this design process, the slow work of democracy in technology design, is what I set as a goal for my research outside of the research lab. Here, what you see here to the right is actually me together with my colleagues in my research group giving a lecture here to Ukrainian refugees that came to Denmark, where we teach them about these are actually people that are quite skilled in technology and used to work with technology in Ukraine. But here we give them lectures on, for instance, how the workflow systems of Danish job centers, how they work. This was not research in the sense of collecting data. We did not write any papers from this intervention. Nevertheless, it became very important for us in terms of realizing in our research how the job center context and was set up differently for different types of stakeholders. And again, to paraphrase Carl de Salvio from before, our engagement with civics also in this case is an opportunity for design. It is this kind of engagement where we as researchers choose to pursue these slow, fraught work of democracy with hope that makes us sensitive in relation to technology design and to know how we need to also, for instance, design workflow systems for various audiences. This is also what I call the work of democracy. Here it's my excellent former PhD student, Asbjørn Amitsbøl Flyger. I think some of you have met him at group maybe, where we are giving a presentation to the Danish Parliament about our research into job centers and the possibility for using AI that I will also come back to later. But first, let's have a closer look at this idea of what is the public sector and what are the differences in terms of what we all understand as public technologies, because working in CSW and trying to publish in international venues, this is actually something I face quite often myself, that it's not simple to explain to others what we mean by public sector technologies. So more and more we are seeing these debates, and here it's a new publication from Data and Society that I can really recommend. They say the word public, as in public sector, often serves as a proxy for the state. In some instances, it means ownership by the state. When the datafied state is a topic of research, data-driven systems owned and operated by the government and the infrastructures they are implicated will become suitable for case studies. However, while the datafied state may rhetorically uphold public interest, whether it does so in practice is an empirical question, is also the point here of Beryl and Singh. I hope you can actually see something that I'm not in the way. The research I will talk about today revolves around studies of technologies designed for Danish job centers. They are institutions that support people in finding a job, but in Denmark there's a little bit with sound. Is it okay? But in Denmark they're also responsible for paying out benefits to people. And then in some ways they resemble the Brazilian job services. Of course, it's not the same, but just to give you a little bit of an example of how we still yet find some similarities across our contexts. And I learned this, that Sim is probably also here today, maybe. Try this one. And before coming here, I thought, okay, I better need to know a little bit more about the Brazilian public sector. But similar to Denmark, Brazil is a country that actually strives to accelerate digitalization of public services. And most recently, I learned Brazil also now has a citizen-based registry since 2019. And that's quite important, right? Because that's the basics, that's the foundation for AI in the public sector, these kind of identifications. And even though my country, Denmark, is a lot smaller, 5.5 million people, actually, if you look at it relatively, our public sector is also big, like in Brazil, and it shares many of the same characteristics. So, for example, we also have a citizen-based registry, and we had it for several years. It's one of the things that we are also worried about sometimes. It really allows for extensive use of data about people. So you have to be very concerned with people's privacy, for instance, and how we secure agency and accountability. And then I thought, maybe you have noticed we have some red and green cards. And the red is no, and the green is yes. So before we go ahead, I thought I would just ask how many here do research together with the public sector? Yeah. Okay, it's actually quite many. And how many use AI with the public sector? And it's fewer, yeah. And it's also in its beginning in Denmark. It's only also we are looking into it, but it's still also very immature. And we're going to use these cards again. So thank you for going along. Okay. So what I really want to talk about here today is what are these openings for studying power differences? How can we actually do this as CSW scholars? And why is it that I think we have a special position? We actually positioned very well in terms of studying these things in the CSW community as we enter the age of data, AI, and automation. A first place to look, I argue, is data work. And normally we think about data work as something data scientists do, but actually, and perhaps even more importantly, as we learn about data and data collection in the public sector, it becomes more and more obvious that caseworkers, clerical workers, any other public servant is quite critical for what we call data work and the shaping of the data sets that AI will eventually learn from. So a very good place to start as a CSW researcher if we want to engage with public institutions is data work. Go and look for the data work, the people, the mundane work that clerical workers, case workers do. That's one place to start. More recently, I'm also turning my attention to the data that are being produced about work when workflow systems and other mainstream technologies in the workplace starts to introduce work tracking. And this is also the case for job centers, for example, where case workers are being tracked in terms of whether they had the mandatory meetings with the citizens that is required by law, how soon their citizens had a job or whatever it may be. Are you tracked as part of your work? Do you know if your universities or others are tracking your work? Green for yes, red for no. Are you being tracked? Maybe. I mean, Microsoft allows also for other smart things. Yeah. So we start to have this realization that most of us, actually there are very few jobs that are not being tracked one way or the other. So we are really seeing this closer tracking of work in details. What has normally been just workflow systems tracking processes is now becoming more and more detailed in terms of our work and what we do. So looking into data work and data about work, I argue that ethnography of the data production processes allows us to understand the potential risks, like bias, both at the level of large data sets and due to individual decisions. So, for instance, one of the caseworkers that comes to form the ground truth of these subjects of decisions of public services. So when we slowly start to see AI being introduced, and now I realize that we don't have a lot of AI yet in public sector technologies, but nevertheless, it's even more important to be aware of the data sets and what forms the ground truth and how that emerges. Turning to the three research challenges that have been central for my work, at least in relation to public sector technologies for the past couple of years, a first challenge I see for CSW is how can we pioneer tracking in work while reinforcing human and democratic values? Secondly, how can we repurpose data across individuals and work domains without risking situated decisions? So with the new identification numbers that every citizen has, it's really important to figure out, well, how do we somehow set some rules of the game when citizens are more easily tracked, then how far can data travel? And third, I've been working to enable participation and democratic values through prototyping stakeholder perspectives, and I will also come back to that. So let's turn to the actual research. A first challenge I've worked towards is how CSW, or how we as CSW researchers can pioneer data tracking while reinforcing human and democratic values. The speed by which data tracking is rolled out in the public workplace calls for an immediate focus in this area, I would argue, because these workflow systems allow for tracking of data work in details. And here, just to say, what do I think of as, for instance, democratic values? So that's, for instance, participation, agency, and accountability. The state has to be accountable. The citizens need to have agency, and it's important that that those who are stakeholders, so those where the systems have consequences for them, also have some kind of participation. As such, I want to argue that we're seeing a new regime now for how society makes decisions, and this is not a phenomenon isolated to Denmark, but we see it in the US, in Brazil, in Austria, in India, in the UK, many more countries where there's a growing access to data, and governments have these data lakes that they can use for prediction and individually based profiling. So, and I realize this is very, very small here, but these are examples. Maybe we'll make the slides available later on, but these are examples of all the ways that the datafied society is now played out. So this includes, for instance, risk score calculation, performance models of public servants, just to give a few examples. When counting work becomes mainstream, counter data are important to mitigate these power differences. And here it's another great book, dear Naja and Klein, that wrote this book, Data Feminism. If you heard about it, did you hear about data feminism? I can definitely recommend it. It's really worth reading. They talk about counter data as the contesting of official definitions, official measurement practices, official analysis practices. Producing counter data isn't only about filling in the gaps of official data, but it's also used to challenge state bias and inaction, to galvanize media and public attention, to work towards policy change and help heal wounded communities. So this is, of course, very much about also saying, okay, data is never neutral. How is it that our data set has been shaped here? And this is my take on, well, what is it then that is so unique about CSW? Well, you may recognize here that one thing we know very well in the CSW community is that we need to look at collaborative work and how work is carried out across at least these 4 dimensions, right? Functional, spatial, temporal, and communicative patterns. So whenever we set up our studies, whenever you are going to design your own research, and there's going to be some data tracking involved, well, as CSW researchers, we are really well positioned to actually look for the functional, the spatial, the temporal, and the communicative. And this is important because if data collection is not done with care, if we are not mindful of the people where we collect data about their work, caseworkers, clerical workers, and other roles, they tend to be invisible by design, for instance, in workflow systems. But we can mitigate that. Let's see. So the point is, of course, that data are never neutral. Assumptions about work are critical to investigate in order to account for power differences in work. Turning to a second challenge or research problem in relation to this datafication of the public sector technologies. Another challenge is this repurposing of data across individuals and work domains in the public sector without risking the situated decisions, of course, because we want to make sure that we always also have the situated decision making. So in this part of my work, which is also joint work, I researched datafication of the public sector in the job center. And we define datafication here as a phenomenon where the increased reliance on data for decision support across contexts makes it challenging for individual citizens to contest or correct data-borne accounts of their situation. And this is again back to, for instance, your new ID system also that is now, I guess, operating in Brazil. And maybe I should ask, do you all have a Brazilian ID now at the time? Yes? Okay. So it is really operating already. But this is, of course, super critical for these kinds of data. So, as with other kinds of, let's see where we, so as with other kinds of law enforcement, citizens' reasonable expectations of agency and personal autonomy can be achieved with technology design. If we, oh, sorry, it didn't shift. Here it is. So, in this particular study, when we went out to talk to individual citizens in job centers, we focused on the interaction, the collaboration, if you want, between citizens and caseworkers. And what we found is that data is very much produced in a relation. So, for instance, contact information on medical specialists was something that the citizen had to give the caseworker, and they registered and documented that. A photo signed of a consent form was a way that the citizen would ensure that their data, or at least that they had some understanding of how their data was being kept. They had a supplementary account from their doctor to kind of back them up in their need for support and welfare services. And also, for instance, citizens would actually sometimes request to record the meeting with the caseworker. Caseworkers don't like that, but it's not a bad idea. We know from patients that are ill that sometimes if you get a difficult message, it's hard to remember afterwards what had been said in the meeting. And so we are seeing all these new forms of data that can be collected, not just by the public sector or caseworker, but also by the citizen. So what this means is that we should consider data as relation. We should see it as the citizens, well, they rely on these small-scale infrastructuring practices of patching together the documentation of their personal and health issues for the job center. They can rely, or we should at least make sure that in the design of these new technologies where we use data about citizens, that they can rely on support persons to also make sure they have more autonomy when we see these technologies enter the scene. And then we need to remember that caseworkers, they remain important for translating how data are being used and can travel and go back. So accountability, data sharing is decided within the specific relation and folded into the hierarchical interactions among caseworkers and the individual in this context of job placement. And other kinds of public authorities get involved. And therefore, we need to have this accountability for how data is being used. Okay. So, turning to this third challenge for CSW, how can we enable participation and democratic values through prototyping stakeholder perspectives? Something that we should be more and more concerned with, I think, is the individual citizen as a figure of the public that has been particularly important for understanding how we can support human and democratic values in technology design. So this is the third problem I worked with in my research, and here I will turn to some of the more experimental research. And I know at least Adriana, you will recognize design fiction here as a new method that we're seeing as being more and more popular How many do you know design fiction here as a method, or speculative design? Yes, some knows it, yep. So important to say, for those who are not familiar with this strand of research, this is not science fiction that we will talk about now, but I'm gonna tell you about design fiction that aims to make explicit what are the future paths towards which technology, research and design are working. So how can we understand the values, assumptions, narratives, commitments that tacitly drive technology research and design? So design fiction is also sometimes called speculative methods. It's a relatively new method, and research papers can be published in this genre, for instance, at the group conference that I know the Brazilian community also engage in. It aims to make explicit here what are these future paths towards technology research and design, like what values, assumptions, narratives, commitments drive our research. The main point is that to envision fictional configurations of technologies and humans that can also give us a better idea of what could be the alternatives. So we want to be sure that we can somehow find ways to imagine the alternatives that are quite different from what is already lined out. It also provides an opportunity to explore potentially negative implications of technology, and this is of course important when we talk about AI, while at the same time working to concretize these alternative paths towards a more desirable future. So the possibility for AI in the public sector is also a matter of, or the reasons why we want to use design fictions is both a matter of we want to have this beforehand or better understanding of what comes before it's, the public sector has already given a budget and made a contract with someone. So we want to mitigate this issue that today often AI decision support happens as an after-the-fact implementation, so we never really get to talk to citizens before the contract has already been signed and some consultancy company is already designing technologies. And we want to make sure that we don't have this problem of always running after technology designers, or that already the big tech companies already designed it. What we see in this picture is the Danish citizen portal for unemployment services. This is the web page, the way it looks today in Denmark when you are unemployed. And here we are seeing a tendency that the individual citizens should take on a more and more active role as a caseworker for themselves. So we're seeing a lot of self-services. Do you also see self-services as a new trend in Brazil? How many people work with self-service technologies? No? How many know of self-service technologies in the public sector? There's some good examples. So one of the places where we see a lot of self-service technologies is in the unemployment services. The argument is that we can't afford to have all these caseworkers, so they want to digitalize it instead. We wanted to know or to see what happens when new forms of data become institutionalized and designed, potentially invisible into the decision-making infrastructure that gatekeep our unemployment services in Denmark. And for this purpose, we developed this design fiction. So what you see here is a totally fictional app. It's not real, I should say. And this is joint work with my former PhD student, Trine Rask Nielsen. But it's a fictional scenario, an app for unemployed citizens where we imagined that they could swap their data. So taking the assumption seriously that data is our new oil. You probably heard that saying, right? Data is the new oil. So taking seriously that data has value, we created this app as a scenario where people could swap their private data in return for benefit. And this is, of course, supposed to be a little bit of a creepy scenario. So let me show you. And there's no sound. Why is there no sound? Okay, we don't have the sound on, but I'll explain. So basically it says here that we have an algorithm that will score you. You can be scored as a low achiever or high achiever job seeker. You can swap your data, social media, your location data, your search patterns, all kinds of things that, at least in Denmark, we think that's kind of private today, and we would not expect the public sector to use this kind of data. So we created this little fictional app. We created this little film that you're seeing here, and then we invited people to participate in this online what would you say, like debate, where they could debate with each other, like an online focus group, how they experienced the fictional app. So basically, we talked to 20 unemployed people, all kinds of people. They were divided into groups of 5, and they were asked to debate, what do you think of the fictional app? What information about you do you see as being personal? When do you think it's okay for job placement to collect such data about you? And what is important to you in terms of being able to trust the job center to use this kind of data about you? And we also had this kind of like small illustrations. So a lot of this is a very like long tradition also for these more speculative design and participatory design studies, is to always make sure, of course, that people have a good basis for engaging. So it's really important to explain concepts, to visualize concepts, to all the time give them some kind of feeling of, let's say, a near future scenario where they can see this happen in order to get some qualified answers. And what we learned was that understanding data as something that may be commodified, that may be seen as fundamentally having value, critically shapes how people's individual experience of this app is unfolding as a research for design here. Data usage we found in the study was experienced by unemployed individuals as more or less reasonable, but their assessment ran into gaps. So the non-technical public understand agency, so their own possibility for influence, who will have their data and what they can be used for. They don't really see that they have any power, actually, and that's a huge concern for us as researchers. And they don't see how they have any power over their situation. So, of course, we all understand that consent is flawed, right? We have all seen these consent forms, they never really work. And this problem actually still exists in these kinds of apps. So even though you as an individual are in charge of what data you want to share, they didn't experience, the citizens we talked to, they didn't experience that they had any power still, because they need to get the welfare they were relying on the money from the state. So it was not a real consent after all, according to these citizens. Another learning is that the designers of public services, they need to be attentive to the limits of how individual agency can be exercised in these conditions. So how can we actually, I mean, the question is actually, how can we set the scene in a way where it ever becomes fair? Because people don't see any other ways when they are relying on public welfare. So the citizens did not view themselves as active participants in the production of data. And that's important because, as we talked about before, data work We typically see this as a matter for data scientists, but actually non-data scientists, even citizens here, are producing more and more data that is being fed into, that we use for data models and training algorithms. So it's quite important that people understand when they're part of producing data, is one point. Another point is that the individuals and the citizens in this study, they need to understand, or to actually experience that they have a possibility to say no. So we still have the consent problem, and we need to keep working on that. So accordingly, designers of public services, and that could be you, or it could be the people you work with, they need to be attentive to the limits of how citizens' agency is exercised in conditions here. Finally, it's critical to understand that when we use speculative design, or when we use design fiction as a method, it's not anything goes. It's quite important. So this is a method that has commitments. It's a genre. And in particular here, okay, we don't see this clearly, but it's actually, this is a paper by Eric P. Baumer, also someone you may know from the group community, and his co-authors that did this great paper evaluating design fiction, the right tool for the job. So if you want to try out these methods, if you want to see for yourself, could this be something for me to work with? I really recommend going back to, for instance, Eric's work here, which is very useful because there are commitments when we want to speculate. We need to have a good understanding of what is baseline. You need to demonstrate that you already know what is state-of-the-art research in this area. You cannot just speculate wildly about something. So that's quite important. And just to underline this fact, what happened in our case, 10 months after we published our paper, Work of the Unemployed, the fictional app you saw before, something happened that we did not imagine. So 10 months later, a large Danish consultancy firm, and together with the organization of all the Danish municipalities, they launched their new version of a totally virtual job center without any physical job center. And this is what we see in this picture. And I don't know if you recognize, I mean, it's pink, yes, but it has some similarities. And we got quite worried, to be honest. I don't think they picked it up from our paper, but we got a little worried when we saw this. What it says is, imagine if the unemployed individual's journey was set up as a digital platform, the virtual job universe where all the individual need is gathered in one place. And you can already hear how this is the dream scenario. No caseworkers, no job centers, all digital. So we need to remember here that the very idea of privacy as an enabler here, and all these ideas of data as something that can easily be swapped and turned into value, it comes at a price, and there's some commitments. And when we as researchers speculate, it can be picked up. So I don't think it was in our case, but sometimes, the near future is 10 months later. And you really have to consider that your research is not misused, basically, right? I will now turn to the final part of my presentation, which is what I call the collab approach. Because, and that's a final thing that I think we as CSW researchers are set up to do. We are very good at collaborating with our stakeholders. So it's something we have a tradition for in CSW, and it's something that we really need to care for and to make sure. I mean, if you have seen what is published in the CAI community, there are very few long-term studies where it's collaborations with institutions and long-term studies. So it's something that we should really care for in the CSW community and take pride in. Leaving aside the design fiction, we decided in my research group to conduct an audit of one of the Danish public algorithms. If you want to go and visit this algorithm, it's no longer in use, I should say, but please do so in a PC. You need to use a computer. It doesn't really work well on a phone. But this is, the idea here was to make an audit of one of the algorithms that were used in a Danish job center. And we wanted to make sure that people could actually try to engage with it. So we wanted people to see, how does an algorithm work? Like, what will it do? And therefore, we also, as part of this research project, created this webpage, again, trying to support democratic dialogue, trying to involve everyone and engage people. And now we're going to do a little exercise again, because before we're going any further into the audit, I want to do a little profiling exercise with you. Are you up for that? And this is, I should say, this is a real life scenario. So to begin with, let me start asking how many of you are more than 56.5 years old? Yes, we have a few, not so many. Okay. And how many of you are not Brazilian of origin? Also very few. Yeah, actually don't even see one. Oh, there's one. Okay, I'm also. Then let me ask you a final question. How many of you have an alcohol or drug abuse? No? Okay, I see a few. We won't mention any names. So now consider for yourself how you see these variables as relevant for deciding on individual citizens' access to public services. Is this fair that you use this kind of information to make decisions on whether people have access to welfare benefits? Well, more concretely, how do we actually create here the data profiles is also what I want to illustrate with this little game, because what happens is that we actually detect patterns, right? And we use these questions that you were asked before as part of, for instance, in this case, it was part of a Danish algorithm that was used to detect who were in risk of being long-term unemployed. So I think you feel the same as me, that it's a bit too much that I ask you whether you have a drug or alcohol abuse. But this is not any question. It's actually part of the variables and the questions that constitutes who are profiled or who were profiled in the Danish job centers as in risk of long-term unemployment. It was later on found to be illegal, this algorithm. Again, I don't want to take credit for this, but it was part of our research to show and to do these audits. And again, here we are going more towards less ethnographic work, but more towards data science. And it shows the need to actually collaborate across disciplines, right? So it's super important to collaborate across disciplines so that we can both look at it from this ethnographic perspective, but also take into account data science or use data science to reverse engineer these algorithms and show what happens in them. And this is what we try to do. And here you see the questions, and they're very small, I realize. But these are the 10 questions that people were asked to answer. So once they went into the Danish webpage of the job center, they were asked to answer these questions. What we found was, in fact, that in the end, the algorithm, we actually considered calling the paper not artificial intelligence, but artificial unintelligence, because the algorithm really wasn't smart, but it also wasn't AI in any way. In the end, what turned out was that if people said, I think it will take me more than 3 months to get a job, then the only thing that mattered was their age. So if they were above 56.5 years, or their heritage, where they originally came from. And as anyone can probably tell themselves in this room, we cannot change our age or where we come from. So how is this a good advice in terms of getting a job? And this is fundamentally where ethnographic methods are useful to say, okay, let's think critically about these issues. Why would it be useful to have people profiled? You can't change these factors, so let's look at something different. In the job center study, what we decided to do was to look at the processes. This was what caseworkers told us. Please look at the processes instead. Where the process is getting long, where they delayed. So instead of focusing on the individual, and this is again close to our CSW interest, let's look at the organization and the processes. Where can we use AI to improve those? So if you go into the web page that I mentioned before, you will see the algorithm here, and you can try to fill out the questions. They're in English, and then you can see how it profiles you. The point is also, of course, and that's back to the discussion about consent, that a checklist approach is never enough. So many of the tech companies that develop these technologies for the public sector, they will say, well, you know, we did follow compliance requirements, we did follow all the conformity assessment, we did have all the certifications, but in fact, it's not enough. This is a good colleague of mine, Irina Slavsky, that you may know. I can really recommend her work as well. She says, ethics concerns the framework and the principles that define our ability to have a good life and to clearly conceptualize our rights, obligations, and responsibilities. However, ethics is not a framework that can be bolted on to the end of a process, nor a set of outcomes against which our actions should be measured, but a process itself. So ethics is an ongoing thing. We need to also, as researchers, we need to ongoingly reflect on our research ethics. And this is where I will end my talk with a call for action for us as a research community. Pursuing ethics as a process is fundamentally about responsibility, our ability to respond. And I hope here that I have demonstrated a few ways that we can do that as CSW scholars, both working through ethnography, working through data science methods, combining them, using speculative design, design fiction, all different methods to critically understand how these technologies work and try to impact and not least give voice to people that will bear the consequences of these technologies. So as a final point for today, I want to argue that a CSW perspective on data, automation, and AI centers on showing the boundaries and the inadequacies of applying techniques from data science, other AI-relevant methods, in terms of these incomplete data sets and the context and practices that shaped it in the first place. And with that, I just want to show you here my fantastic research group, my lab, the Confronting Data Co-Lab. You're also invited to go and visit our webpage if you want to, where you can read more about our work. And otherwise, I just really want to thank you so much for the invitation to come and to meet your fantastic community. I've known several Brazilian CSW researchers through the years, and it's really my great pleasure to be here today. I hope we have more conversations, and if you have any questions, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naja, for your wonderful talk. And I think we have time for some questions. And yes. Surprise.
I never talk, but you gave such a exciting presentation with so many issues that it's important, not only for this community, but as a society to discuss. That is, I have many questions, but I think I'm just going to make one. It's about, I like the design fiction approach. It let us think about the future. And I got very intrigued by the one that you did because, well, by a coincidence, I have participated in a discussion about that, about the individual right of selling your own data. And what I am wondering, and if you did some kind of research exactly exploring the discussion, the ethical discussion that might have raised, like, when I'm selling my data, I'm not just selling my data. I actually, because my profile is part of many other people, include many other people, I might be endangering someone else. So it's mine, but well, kind of, so it's not. And something else is like, again, thinking about the ethical perspective, it's almost similar as selling my kidney or my eye. I'm starving, I'm going to die, but it's not immortal, acceptable that I'm going to sell, at least in Brazil, now, I'm going to sell my eye because I don't want to die. And this is the government problem. So somehow allowing people to sell your parts, and I'm considering data as part of it, is also a way that the government is kind of a decentralizing some responsibility, and like the society is not taking care of the individual. So I'm just wondering if you and somebody in your group are discussing or actually got this subject as a way of doing research, since it's the science fiction, what you did. And related to that, no, it's just like in the second, it's like you said that the research that you did actually gives some idea for the private sector to develop a work app. So there is also responsibility, our responsibility as a researcher, to think about which research we do, because we give the companies ideas. Okay, this is a good idea, and they can responsibilize us. Says, no, I'm just cite you. Like, well, the idea was hers. Thank you.
Sorry, let's see if I can find another microphone.
Thank you for that question, and you're quite right. I also see all those issues. I think what is important for me is this is why I actually argue that we need to bring in political theory and also political philosophy into the discussions that we're having in computer science. So if we want to really understand how society is changed, we can actually go to Max Weber. So Max Weber has some excellent, interesting theory on bureaucracy and how the algorithm is really just an extension of bureaucracy. So that's one interesting way to kind of connect the discussions and say, this is the societal contract that is being changed. This is actually the relationship between the citizen and the state that we are shifting here, or where we're shifting power balances. There's some excellent work by a scholar called Ari Lampinen as well, that you may know in the CSW community. She has this paper on bureaucracy and algorithms that shows how it's simply shifting power balances. So we renegotiate the contract. But one way to go about this, you said, okay, it's like, selling our kidney. So one way to think about this problem is, for instance, Elinor Ostrom. She won the Nobel Prize, and she had this interesting theory about resources, collective resources. So similar to water, and climate and all these shared resources that we all depend on. We should see data as something that is also collective, so it's something where we can't think about it as something you own. It's not good if we think about water as something that can be owned and not where some will not have water. We all depend on water, right? We can't live without it. In the same way, we can think about the problems with data as a collective resource or as something that is always produced in a relation. The problem is, of course, in Europe, we have GDPR, and we are already far down that road where we think about it as private and value and money and all that. But I think it's a basic research problem to consider how can we see it more as a collective resource where you are not, where we somehow make sure there's regulation so that people don't sell their kidney or their data, or at least we are very, very careful in the same way that we are very careful with how you can donate your kidney, for instance. So I think that's spot on. So that was your first question, and your second question was, now I forgot what was the second. The private sector, yes, and how, yeah, so there's some interesting work. It's now been a couple of years. There was some work in what was called the ACM Future of Computing Academy. I don't think it exists anymore, but there were a lot of good discussions going on whether ACM should have a form that we could all somehow, where we could disclose how we would allow our research to be used by the private sector. And I think that ACM found that it was too difficult to do in practice. But the discussion is really interesting. I think there's, at least if you look for Brent Hecht and Lauren Wilcox, some of these scholars looked into how can we actually walk this fine balance and somehow try to disclose, not just say, these are the limitations for our studies, but also say, you know, how we don't want them to be misused, or so really extend our limitations sections in papers to also say how, you know, we imagine our work to be, our research to be applied in practice, and how we don't want it applied, or if that makes sense. So it's a really nice discussion that can be revisited. I think they have a piece called "Who Should Save Us from AI" or something like that. If you Google "Who Should Save Us from AI," I think that's New York Times, one of those big newspapers that brought it a couple of years ago. It's quite interesting.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm working with my PhD project is with vulnerable populations, and we are doing some workshops to try to get from their necessities about data for the territories. So I was thinking about using design fiction to try to discover what are their necessities, because imagining is a good way to try to get the future, and we have many problems occurring. So I would like to ask you if you have ideas to turn on their imagination in these workshops, and if you have some tips to give to us.
I definitely do. That sounds very interesting, and thanks for that question. I think, I mean, one thing that is important to understand here in our study is that we spent a long time doing ethnographic field work. So we couldn't make this app out of the blue, but actually there was like, I think around 3 or 4 years of ethnographic field studies going before this. And now I know we don't have time for that when we're PhD students, right? So it's a luxury to spend that long time. But nevertheless, going to your field site and making sure that you really have like a good understanding of your field site is of course the first step. And then I think what we did was, so using these kinds of visualizations, we actually in this case, and you will see if you read the paper, in this case, another paper inspired us. And this was actually something where I was asked to comment on a study where they had developed an algorithm that could track people at work. So basically this is based on an algorithm that is already out there and functioning, where people would be profiled as low achievers or high achievers in their workplace. And it took all kinds of data, like data about location and how you search and all that. So I think sometimes going to a different context. So in our case, this was a study for the workplace, and we were inspired. This paper is called Work of the Unemployed. So we were inspired, you can say, about a workplace study that was about efficiency and algorithms. And then we said, okay, this scenario is quite interesting. What if we swap it and instead say it's actually the unemployed people who have to do a lot of work here to collect benefits? And then we started speculating that way to say, okay, something that we see in the workplace, tracking of location, tracking of your search patterns, all this. How do we see it play out here? Another thing was we went to the media. So usually, I don't know how it is in Brazil, but in Denmark, it's very polarized. So either people are really like excited about AI, or they're very, very skeptical. And there you can usually also pick up some of the hype. You know, people are like, oh, but we can use the national, the travel card that you use for the metro. We can pick up that data and then use it for the unemployment services. So we also went to the media to see, you know, what are the different hypes and ideas people have there, and then test them. And then we also went to scenarios that some of the more critical, again, NGOs, civics groups and all that were discussing. So there were some extreme scenarios of a lady, she was not able to work, but she was really good at baking, and she had an Instagram account where she put up stuff she baked. And the municipality picked up her account as well and said, oh, but this is surely not, then you are, if you can bake, you can work. And so we took these scenarios from the media, from the civics groups, from other domains, and then we tried to bring them into a job center context. But of course, getting to this place also requires that you know your domain, right? So you really need to know your domain. You need to know what is state of the art in job centers. What are the workflow systems looking like today? And then you can start speculating what would be the future. And then secondly, what happened was, of course, COVID. So suddenly COVID just shut down everything, right? So you probably also had the experience of suddenly everything went from physical to virtual. And that's another thing. And I read a lot of design fiction. It's actually a good way to get inspired too. So all kinds of things. Thank you.
Thank you a lot. I have a question. We have serious problems in Brazil with the privacy of our data. In recent years, several types of scams have been carried out using personal data, deceiving unsuspecting people. In Denmark, do you have any problem like this with the privacy?
Yes.
How can I avoid it?
Yeah. Yes, we unfortunately also have the scams, and they're very good. So they can copy all kinds of, like, oh, this is an email from your taxes, or this is from some other public authorities. So we unfortunately also have that issue. I think it makes, for instance, the group of citizens that are elderly, they're very vulnerable, but also younger people actually. So what we are discussing is how we can have this kind of, skill. So how can you develop this skill? Right now, the discussion is that people should have some kind of technology understanding in primary school. So already when they're very, very young, they're taught how to understand digital footprints and the possibility of being scammed. And so really educate people from their children. But also we have campaigns. It's very often that the authorities will go out and say, oh, there's a scam going around at the moment, where they try to say so and so. I think the best thing we can do is probably to think through this kind of literacy. So technology literacy, and then also the point about support persons. So always allowing for support persons, but then at the same time recognizing that we don't want to push all the work on people, on their support persons or their or themselves. So the problem is that the business case for many of these solutions is, of course, oh, but we don't need any caseworkers. The paper we wrote here with Geraldine Fitzpatrick and Chris Lidentek, which you may know. Now I'm just trying to find it, this paper on datafication. In this paper, I think the main point is that caseworkers need to be the ones that help people navigate. So you need someone that translates, help people navigate. So maybe they used to be the ones that document, but now I think their role will shift to become more guides, someone that can help navigate, help translate what it means to citizens. So we should be careful with the business cases where we take away caseworkers because they're still needed, but with a different role, I think. Thanks.
I'm going to just hijack the microphone because I also have a question. And it segues nicely from what you just said, because I've been wondering when you start talking about data, that some people are going to be left out and they're not going to understand as we move towards this. They're not going to understand how their data is being used, what the data is for, and how. So how do we help them understand the literacy, not just the technological part, but understanding how data is used, what it's going to be used for, understanding that AI, hallucinates, and where the results are coming from. Do you see any, some way out of that?
I see a role for regulators. So politicians need to regulate and make sure that you need to disclaim. So if you provide a service, you also have to disclaim, this may hallucinate, this is not a search engine. And part of also what does it mean to have digital skills? I think part of it is to understand that we all tried a calculator, right? 1 + 1 is always 2 in the calculator. It's a fact. But the shift here is with generative AI is that it's certainly a statistical tool. It's no longer a fact. It's more like a possibility. Or so we need to really shift our minds from thinking about facts to thinking about statistics. And everybody has to know that this is a probability. This is a likely answer, but you should have a disclaimer maybe to say there is a risk that it hallucinates. There's a risk that this comes with bias. So I think you need to have these disclaimers. That's one way, at least, you could start by saying to people, what are the limitations, right? And be upfront about it. And unless it's regulated and by law, I don't think we can make the technology, the big tech do it. But I mean, it would be obvious to have this kind of disclaimer.
I think we have time for one last question, if anybody wants to ask. No? Is everybody good? So, então vou falar em português, porque foi aniversário dela ontem. Então, vou puxar o parabéns, todo mundo tem que cantar. O bolo vai entrar. Que é para fazer passar vergonha. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
For your talk. Thank you so much for coming. And we know it was your birthday 2 days ago. So we'd like to bye. Coffee break. Não vamos para o coffee break. Se não me engano, tem brigadeiro. Não comam tudo. Não comam tudo que eles têm que jogar. Pãozinho delícia também, que é daqui, isso eu conheço. So,